Okay, want to start out by thanking all of y'all for being here to listen to me talk about what I believe and why I believe it. So today I'm going to tell you about why I don't believe in God or creation. So I'm not sure if most of you know, but most atheists were actually at one time Christian. I was actually raised in a Catholic environment, and I was Christian until I was 25. At that point, I reevaluated what I believed because a friend challenged me in my Christian faith. He claimed that you could only be considered a real Christian if you take the Bible literally. At that point, I already knew I wasn't considered a real Christian because I didn't believe in a literal interpretation of the Bible. I had already accepted that evolution was a fact of reality and that Noah's Ark couldn't be a real event. Today, I want to express to you all why I ever became an atheist, and before I ever became an atheist, I rejected creationism. I also want to explain why I eventually lost belief in any God existing. Before I start, though, I want you all to know that I'm not here to change your mind about anything or push any position on you. I'm here to give you insight into what I believe and why I believe it. That doesn't mean that you have to or should believe the same things that I do. Starting with creationism, there are several reasons why I don't think that it is the best explanation for the diversity of life on Earth. First, creationism violates the minimum viable population for any organism. This would be the minimum population that would provide enough genetic diversity to ward off genetic defects due to inbreeding. Creationism speculates that 2 people populated the entire planet with people. Then, after a global flood, 8 people populated the entire planet. The MVP of humans is 4,169 individuals, and any less than that would not provide the genetic diversity needed to fill the world with people. Creationism can't explain why all organisms violate this principle in its hypothesis, yet we find numerous organisms alive today. A supernatural claim that God just did it is not an explanation. Next, we can genetically link all organisms together through a common ancestor. If all organisms were designed by a creator, why did he seem to only make small changes out of existing structures for each organism? Why not just design all new structures? Take the giant and red panda's thumb, for instance. It's the 6th pseudodigit on the hands of the pandas that is evidently a modified version of a bone in the hand, the radial sesamoid. How can the hypothesis of creation explain this feature? It can say, well, God wanted pandas to have a 6th digit, and so he created them in this way. If God is really creating organisms from scratch, he has the ability to completely overhaul the design of the panda's hand in order to produce the desired morphology. If that's the case, why does it appear as though God modified the radial sesamoid to do it? Why does God appear to be so keen on modifying pre-existing structures? As would be expected according to the process like evolution, rather than creating new organisms from scratch. You could also say that God just copied the blueprint from one organism and changed it a little bit, but that is just an illogical special pleading argument. Evolution would predict that the giant and red pandas would have a common ancestor. Through adaptation to their environment, both giant and red pandas would develop the pseudodigit to help them survive in some way, and that's exactly what we find in reality. The giant and red pandas have a common ancestor 40 million years ago. Due to their diet of almost exclusively bamboo, they developed the 6th pseudodigit which helped them eat bamboo to survive in their environment. Evolution has an actual explanation for the development of these pandas. Another big piece of evidence that creationism can't explain is the fusion of 2 chromosomes in humans. Taxonomically, we are part of the great ape family that also consists of orangutans, gorillas, and chimps. One of the reasons we know this is because of chromosome 2. The other great apes have 24 pairs of chromosomes, while we only have 23 pairs. Chromosome 2 in humans shows evidence of a fusion of 2 chromosomes, and we know this because of similar banding patterns, the existence of 2 centromeres on the chromosome, and the existence of telomeres in the middle of the chromosome. Telomeres only exist on the ends of chromosomes. These are just a few specific examples but what it boils down to is the inability of the creation hypothesis to be an explanation for anything. It is an ad hoc assertion that God did it or God wanted it that way, and those aren't explanations for anything. Now, you don't have to be an atheist to believe in evolution or accept evolution or disregard creationism. So now I want to tell you why I don't believe in any definition of God. So I don't believe that the God of the Bible exists because there's insufficient evidence to suggest that he does. I want to start off by explaining that I am also agnostic to the idea of a God existing. So to accurately describe myself, I would say that I don't know if a God exists, but I also don't believe one to exist. So I'm going to briefly examine some of the arguments for God's existence. The teleological argument is an argument from design. Basically, everything looks designed, so therefore it is designed. Just because something looks designed doesn't mean that it is designed, though. If we have natural explanations for some process, then we don't need a supernatural explanation. The teleological argument is a supernatural explanation for natural processes. Next, the fine-tuning argument is a variation of the teleological argument. It basically says that the universe is fine-tuned for life to arise. Usually, it's pointed out that there are constants that, if changed, would not permit life to arise. What they don't tell you about this is that we don't know the sets of values what the sets of values would be if you changed even one constant. It's possible for life to exist under a different set of conditions. Sometimes it's brought up how the Earth is in the Goldilocks zone of our solar system. The Goldilocks zone is huge to us, but small on the solar system scale. And we vary in difference from the sun. We vary in distance from the sun on the order of about 1 million miles in either direction. The sheer number of systems and planets that we know to exist guarantee that there are other planets in the respective Goldilocks zones and are able to produce life. Basically, the fine-tuning argument lacks evidentiary support. Another argument for God's existence is the cosmological argument, which is also known as the first cause argument. I don't deny that some event caused the universe to come into existence. I just accept that the most likely explanation is a natural one, considering that all of the events that have occurred do occur naturally without supernatural intervention. According to the inflaton hypothesis, the inflation of the universe was caused by a fluctuation in the inflaton quantum scalar field, which then released an immense amount of energy that then transformed into what would eventually become the matter that we interact with today. This is our best guess for how the universe came into existence. It's actually a giant leap in logic to suggest that a creator is needed for the universe to exist. There are also more philosophical arguments, like the argument for morality. This postulates that you need God in order to have morality or absolute morality. However, a simple examination of social groups throughout time show that moral foundations change as social norms change. It's an ever-changing landscape of morality. Moral foundations also change even now depending on the culture and society that you live in. Even in Christianity, you have different opinions on what this absolute morality is supposed to be. At one point in time, it was ordained by God to have slaves and treat them in certain ways. Now it's seen as abhorrent to practice slavery, even though this God mandated it at one time. So morality, at least to me, doesn't seem like it's tied to a God at all. Instead, it seems to be dictated by the population of organisms that have moral foundations. Now, previously, I had gone over why I don't believe in a God in general. This would include any definition of God that exists. Those particular arguments don't support the conclusion that God exists. But I wanted to touch briefly on why I don't believe in the God of the Bible. And technically, I would be considered Gnostic on this particular definition of God due to the counter evidence. I would assert that this God definitely doesn't exist. So, the first reason is the fact that Genesis doesn't match what we know to be true about reality. We know that our planet is 4.5 billion years old. We do not find that men have been created from dirt and women from rib bones. The way in which the first 5 books of the Bible are written does not indicate that a single person, Moses, wrote them. Instead, they were written by various authors in what is called the documentary hypothesis. This is where several authors wrote different portions of the Pentateuch, and then later redactors and editors stitched them together. We know this because of the textual analysis that was done on the text. We also know that the history of the Israelites in the Bible does not match what we find archaeologically in the area that they were in. In fact, the Israelites have been shown to be a small sect of Canaanites that broke off and started their own group. So the Old Testament doesn't offer us anything that matches what we experience in reality. Next, the New Testament doesn't relay actual history. We know that the Gospel of Mark wasn't written until 70 AD, and that the other Gospels copied off of Mark as well as each other in order to generate their narrative. Paul states that his only source was scripture and visions of Jesus. The New Testament doesn't contain any eyewitness accounts of Jesus, only visions and interpretations of Old Testament prophecies about the Messiah. The New Testament has many forged epistles and accounts that are considered canon now, like 1 and 2 Timothy and Titus. There isn't any evidence outside of the Bible to suggest that Jesus died or resurrected. All current outside references use the Gospels either directly or indirectly. Paul is our only contemporaneous source, and he only cites visions and scriptures as his sources. There are many more historical reasons of why I don't consider the Gospels or the New Testament to be an accurate account of what happened in the first century, but these reasons, compiled with the Old Testament, don't warrant a belief in the God of the Bible. And so the main takeaway from everything that I've said today is that what is claimed by creationism, theism, and specifically Christianity does not match what I see in reality. Every time I compare the different explanations, the only real explanation seems to come from a naturalistic perspective. This doesn't mean that I think I'm absolutely correct about this. In fact, I could be completely wrong. Ultimately, I don't know if a God exists or not. What I do know is that all the evidence that's presented to me thus far has been insufficient and has been unable to convince me that a God or gods exist. And that's my presentation. I welcome any and all questions.
How do you explain archaeological finds that confirm things discussed in the Bible? Do you think the Bible is completely mythical, or is some of it historical?
So I don't think that it's all myth. There are some historical aspects to it, like the succession of kings in the Israelite kingdom and kingdoms. I think those roughly match up, although, there are, like, when I talked about the Pentateuch and how the Israelites formed, which is, I guess, specifically what I said, we actually, like, for instance, in the book of Numbers, you have a lot of accounting of the numbers of the people of Israel. And they end up numbering like in the millions, if I remember correctly, and we just don't see that kind of population in the area that they were supposed to be in at the time that they were supposed to be there. Another thing is, like in Exodus, we don't find that the Egyptians had a lot of Jewish slaves that then exited Exodus in the fashion that is recorded by the Bible. So it's not that I think that there's just absolutely no historical significance to some things in the Bible, but the important things, like about where the Israelites originated from and things of that nature, as well as the gospel accounts, I don't think that those relay actual history, even if they have some historical attributes to them. Like, for instance, in the New Testament, you have Pilate and Herod and other people of that nature. You have different places that are actually historical too. But these are, like, on the idea that they were created to tell a narrative is supported by them including, these historical places. It's just like with, I don't mean for this to be demeaning or anything, but it's like any fictional story that you have now that includes real places like New York City or London or anything like that. Just because those things have some real places, events, or people in them does not mean that those are actual history either.
Where do people go when they die?
Obviously, I don't believe in an afterlife. I believe that it's very similar to, where we were before we were born. I feel like we just sort of, go away, I guess. I don't know if there's an afterlife or not. And I would hazard to bet that nobody can really truly know whether or not an afterlife exists. But I just simply don't believe that we continue living on after this life. But I would also say that puts way more meaning on my life. I cherish my life more. I value my life a whole lot more, knowing that this is the only life that I get. And that's not, I don't want anybody to take away that I think that you guys, or Christians rather, don't value their lives as much as me. I'm just saying, in my own personal experience, after I came to the conclusion that an afterlife probably most likely doesn't exist, that put a lot more meaning on my life personally.
Why did Josephus write about Jesus if he didn't exist or die on the cross?
Well, I'm very glad you brought this up, because this does fall into one of the subject areas that I'm way more passionate about. So the Testimonium Flavianum, which is what you're talking about here, we've actually got really good, solid evidence to suggest that he didn't even write that particular portion. Now, you have a lot of New Testament scholars out there that will say, well, a previous version that was more, I guess, Jewish in nature probably existed, but we don't actually have any good evidence to suggest that is true. All of the manuscripts that we have only date back to the 3rd century from a church father named Eusebius. He was notorious for adding multiple things in different locations and even changing his own church history multiple times. So the only reference that we have of Josephus's is coming from Eusebius, and we don't have any indication, not from Origen, who is another church father that existed before Eusebius, or anybody else that references Josephus's Testimonium Flavianum. There's also stronger evidence in the fact that the composition of that particular passage does not match what Josephus writes in other areas. The way he uses verb forms and the way that the story is even structured doesn't match how Josephus writes in Antiquities. But not only that, but we definitely know that Eusebius's version is the only version, because there's a Syriac and Arabic version that also exists that seems to be what people consider to be an earlier version of it. But we've actually been able to trace back through a chain of custody that this version is actually a redacted version of the same passage that Eusebius has. So we have multiple lines of evidence that suggest that this particular passage was never written by Josephus himself. And any scholar out there would tell you that he definitely didn't write the highly Christianized versions of it. But the place that it appears in Josephus's work also breaks up a logical flow in the stories that he's telling, because the paragraph after it actually references the paragraph before the Testimonium Flavianum. So there's a lot of reasons to think that it most likely was never actually written by Josephus.
Do you think Jesus was at least a historical figure?
Well, technically, my position is mythicism. I don't think that Jesus actually existed on Earth. I think that the evidence that we have suggests that Paul and other apostles had visions of Jesus, and they took the Old Testament scriptures and they assumed that he had done all these things. And then the New Testament Gospels, they euhemerized him into history. So I don't think that he was actually a real person, but I also don't think that necessarily destroys the faith of Christianity.
Why are humans the only animals with the ability to ponder our own existence? How would that evolve when it's not beneficial and can be harmful to us?
Well, I mean, I would say that we can't really know whether or not other sentient or semi-sentient creatures ponder their own existence or even ask themselves questions. I mean, I would say that even on a basic level, or other animals and organisms ask themselves questions all the time. They are more or less based on their instincts, though, as far as like answering them instead of actually reasoning them out. But to answer your question, I would say that once our central nervous system, our brains, were able to develop and be complex enough, that's when we were able to start reasoning things using critical thinking skills and things of that, like pondering our existence. We developed larger brain cavities, and that allowed our brains to grow larger and to develop in more complex ways, and allowed us to gain that ability.
Didn't the first humans need to be provided a moral foundation? Otherwise, wouldn't survival of the fittest allow murder?
Well, so first off, survival of the fittest doesn't mean the survival of the most violent or the physically strongest. It really should be understood as the survival of the ones that's best fit for that environment. They're most adapted to live in that environment so that they can survive and propagate the species. If you think about it, in the past, when you have these groups of people that are like, let's say, hunter-gatherers, I mean, they didn't exactly have a moral law as we would understand it now. And even societies in the past haven't always had the same ideas about murder or killing another individual. We've always had this concept of, killing an individual of a different society or a different country has always been, different for us. It's not seen as murder. Like even now we have wars where we kill each other and it's not murder. It's wartime killing. So you have a lot of these nuances that happened. I don't think that you need a God in order for people to know that not killing the other members of your group or society is ultimately beneficial for that group or society. I think it has more to do with the survivability of a group of people rather than, getting this knowledge from a deity.
You said it was ridiculous to believe man was created from dirt and woman from his rib, but isn't it more ridiculous to think that Earth popped into existence from nothing?
Very good question. But the way that the Earth came into existence isn't that it came from nothing. In fact, there were several billion years of the universe's existence before the Earth came into existence or developed. And the way that planets develop, we've actually been able to look out into space, and we have seen, solar systems develop and everything like that. But basically what ends up happening is you have these giant portions, and I'm talking on a universal scale, huge sections of gases that are then collapsed through a dying star in another system or in some other way. They're collapsed, right? And they form all these dust particles. And then eventually a star forms in the middle of it or some other kind of gravitational body. And then planets will start to form around that through static forces at first, and then through gravity, attracting different portions to it and eventually forming planets. And then we could go into how the Earth, got water, formed an atmosphere and all this other stuff. But essentially, I don't think that the Earth just popped into existence out of nothing. What ended up happening was there was a singularity or a single point in space that then, inflated in less than 10 to the negative 32 seconds of the universe existence. It inflated to what the size of the universe, and then it kept on expanding after that. And it wasn't for about 300,000 years that even atoms were able to form, because it was so hot and dense at that point that they just weren't able to form. That's when the first bits of light were actually able to travel through the universe because it had cooled down enough. So there's actually a lot of processes that go from the inflation of the universe to the Earth and where it's at today.
How did human life begin to exist?
Well, the I can't remember how what the current science tells us about how long it's been since life has been here. But as far as humans go, we know that humans started to develop around 200 to 300,000 years ago in sub-Saharan Africa. But I mean, even before that, you had various proto-animals that would have come prior to Homo sapiens, because there's a lot of, the Homo genus is kind of wide, and it's got a lot of diversity in it that doesn't exist today, but we also are, taxonomically and genetically linked with the other great apes that exist out there. And the development of humans developed out of already existing organisms, and those organisms developed out of already existing organisms. And we can trace this back through the fossil record, and we can go back quite a ways to microbial life, like single-celled organisms. We have evidence of single-celled organisms, being here that long ago. So it's a gradual change over time, and it's a change that's predicated by, your environment or what food sources are available. Like there's this thing called the Great Oxygenation Event, where bacteria started to release a lot of oxygen into the atmosphere, and that's what allowed life to actually move from the water to the land. So changes in environment, changes in food sources, those are driving factors in the change in life.
According to the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, which is not a theory but a fact, wouldn't the energy released from a quantum fluctuation only exist for an incredibly short amount of time?
Good question. For one thing that I want to touch on at first is that theories are actually very well supported. Scientific theories are very much different than just general theories. Scientific theories are built on existing evidence and repeatability. So scientific theories like evolution are facts of reality, just like the Heisenberg uncertainty principle. But what we find with quantum physics and is as close, the closer that we get to the inflation of the universe, we find that the natural laws of physics seem to break down. We also notice these laws of physics breaking down, like at the event horizon of a black hole. The inflaton hypothesis is our current best explanation for how the inflation occurred. We know that the inflation occurred for sure due to the cosmic microwave background radiation. We've been able to take pictures of it. And so while it's still a hypothesis about the inflaton field and the quantum fluctuation, it is currently our best explanation for it. And that's about as satisfying of an answer that I can give you. I'm not a quantum physicist, so I can't explain the details of that particular aspect of it. I just know the current best explanation for it. But I would also say that even if we never figure out for sure 100% how the inflation happened, that doesn't necessarily mean that a God was needed in order to do it. We would still need to prove this causal link between an outside supernatural figure and causing things to happen in our reality. And I know that you guys, not you guys, but Christians in general feel like miracles have happened. But I have been unconvinced of those miracles.
No object is ever created from nothing. So in the Big Bang, where did the space come from that the inflation moved into?
Well, so prior to the inflation of the universe, we're not exactly sure what existed, and we may never be able to know the state of the universe prior to the inflation. We do know that whatever happened prior to the inflation doesn't really affect what happens after the inflation. But at the point of inflation, basically you had a singularity that then inflated to the size of the universe in what seems to be an instantaneous manner. In actuality, it was in the first 10 to the negative 23 second or 32 seconds of the universe's existence that it inflated. So it would seem almost instantaneous.
Can you give an example of macroevolution, like a fish turning into a monkey?
Well, so there's this thing called the law of monophyly that pretty much says that once an organism is part of a monophyletic tree, like branch or whatever, it will always be that thing. So, like for fish will always be fish, or whatever particular taxonomically how it's classified. It will always be in that fish category. So there's no way for a fish to turn into a monkey. But what we find is that if we go back far enough, the trees on the tree of life, they branch off. So while, like, for instance, canines will always be canines, they can morphologically change into something that looks drastically different. If you take a look at whales originally started out as land quadrupeds, and then due to a change in their environment, they lost most of their hind legs and they turned into the whales and dolphins that you see now. But these would be examples of macro evolution that you're talking about. But I feel like you're wanting like something in nature that we can observe on a human lifetime timescale to change morphologically into a different animal. And we just simply don't live long enough to see that happen. These changes take place over millions and millions of years. Where we can see that take place is in the fossil record. We see in the fossil record with whales, we see a clear progression leading backwards towards the land from a land quadruped. We see this all throughout the fossil record. Like, there was one kind of Tyrannosaurus Rex that was really small, and that was only recently discovered. And you can find these fossil links all over the fossil record.
Isn't proposing that millions and billions of years have occurred an ad hoc argument that instantly makes your statement credible? Because there's no way to prove millions and billions of years have happened.
Okay, that's a very good question. The fact that the universe has been around for 13 and a half billion years or so, and the fact that the Earth has been around for 4.5 billion years doesn't exactly have an effect on the evolutionary theory. Evolutionary theory is driven by processes by like sexual selection, artificial selection, natural selection, those kind of things. And those things do take a lot of time to happen. But of course, the way that we know that the Earth, that the universe is 13 some odd billion years old, is because we've been able to detect certain things in the universe, like the cosmic microwave background radiation, that would only be that way if it was that old. Now, for the Earth, we've been able to collect samples from like meteorites that have hit the Earth, from objects that were around when the Earth would have been forming, and we've been able to do certain types of radiometric dating on those rocks and find out how old they are. So we've been able to do a best guess there. We've also been able to uncover several very, very old pieces of I believe it's crystal, I believe, that we've been able to date radiometrically, and those have shown the Earth to be 4.5 billion years old, right around about that area. Now, radiometric dating is reliable and unreliable at the same time. Radiometric dating can give us a good area of like a good span of time in which something came into existence, right? Like fossils. Fossils aren't actually bone, they're stones. And so we have to date them in a very specific way so that we can, get the date of them, either by dating the rocks around them or potentially even dating the fossils themselves, depending on the material that they're made of. But what it comes down to is that radiometric dating relies on the half-life of radioactive material, not radioactive, but isotopes. The half-lives of these isotopes are constant. As far as we can tell and test, they are constant. So you would need to be able to explain why all of these tests and all of these materials seem to date so far back in the past using methods that we know to work.
Since radiometric dating is unreliable, doesn't that disprove your claim since you don't have a foolproof way of determining age?
Well, so I said that they're both reliable and unreliable. They're unreliable when you don't use them correctly. It's very similar to like if you have a nail and you try to nail that nail into some wood with a screwdriver. You can definitely misuse certain radiometric dating methods to make it seem like they're unreliable. And there's even like trace amounts that can happen. That's why multiple samples are dated and they give an average amount of time in which they existed and not a definite amount of time that they existed. So while you might have like a radiometric dating of like, let's say 5 million years or something like that, right? You might get that, but it might have it'll probably have a caveat of like 300,000 years or so, something like that. So, I mean, in this particular area of science, you don't deal with absolute dating, right? You deal with more of a range of dates that it could have possibly existed in.
Were you confident in your belief in God before your friend challenged your belief?
Well, I mean, yeah. I mean, I felt pretty confident in the idea that a God existed and that, if that's what you mean.
Was yours a justified belief in God or blind faith?
Well, I mean, you have to understand, I come from North Alabama. This is a very religious area, and it was taught to me that God existing and that you got to be religious, specifically Christian, was kind of just a default state, I guess you could say. So I didn't critically think about what I believed, and I didn't critically question whether or not a God existed. I didn't have like apologetic like arguments for my faith just because I was never questioned on it and I had never been challenged on it, really. It was always just sort of, oh, of course, God exists. It wasn't until I had like a very, very close friend at the time really question me on why I believed the things that I believed or what I considered myself to believe in that I started examining it. And that's kind of where it started for me.
Why isn't there more written history if man is 200,000 years old?
Well, it's a very good question. We really didn't start writing things down and coordinating things in a way that would give us written history until pretty far into human history. I mean, we do have cave paintings where people, the early people painted on like cave walls and stuff like that, or on, I guess, maybe on the sides of mountains. So, I mean, we do have evidence of like early human civilization in various ways, not to mention the cave paintings and stuff like that. But simply put, we didn't really come to a stage in like our development where we were working cohesively together. We had like, we started out as sort of hunter-gatherer groups, and you'd have these giant groups. There weren't really like nations or anything like that. So you had these different groups, and it wasn't until we really started, working in larger groups that, recorded history started being developed.
Isn't it strange that the history recorded in the Bible lines up with when we started writing? Why would man exist for so long and not write anything down?
Well, I mean, as far as like how far back the Bible dates and everything like that, we definitely have multiple civilizations that kept written records of their civilizations that existed prior to the formation of the Israelites. I mean, we just like for instance, the Code of Hammurabi that existed way before.
But the genealogical record in the Bible goes back 6,000 years, while evolution claims humanity had been around 195,000 years without any records.
I don't have like a good answer for you on that, just because I haven't really researched the origins and the time frame of like how we developed like these histories and stuff like that. I do know that the written history goes back, pretty far ways back, even before the Israelites started writing and everything. So it seems to me like we kind of reached a position in our social and economic development and the size of our groups that warranted like doing things other than just hunting and surviving and gathering and stuff. So I think it only appears to have just exploded at once. I think that this explosion probably, like other things that we know of, happened much more gradually over time, and it's really hard to keep written accounts now. So that's not to say that there weren't written accounts that existed way before then. Just the things that we have evidence for, those only go back so far.
How would you explain irreducible complexity?
Okay, that's a very good question. Irreducible complexity really isn't a thing. Generally, what's cited with irreducible complexity is the bacterial flagellum, or the eye, but we've actually been able to manipulate the bacterial flagellum and find that the bacterial flagellum, when modified to like remove certain proteins and certain components, it doesn't actually disappear. It just reduces the mobility of that particular bacteria. And we've actually been able to find out that through one particular protein, it changed and it was able to eventually develop into the bacterial flagellum. So we do have a lineage for the bacterial flagellum that shows that it developed out of much simpler components. The eye that I mentioned a second ago, we actually have examples of every stage of the eye that's in existence today. We can visually represent all the different stages of how the eye developed. And so the irreducible complexity is not really a thing, because we have not found any structure in nature that seems to have been specially created.
How did woodpeckers evolve? Wouldn't they have killed themselves by bashing their heads into trees before they had developed anatomic features allowing them to do so?
Well, I don't know the evolutionary lineage of woodpeckers, but generally with evolution and natural selection, or evolution by natural selection, what you have is a gradual change in these birds. So basically what you would expect to find is that some ancestor way back when, they didn't have the exact same morphology as a woodpecker, but as you followed that population, that species, what you have is a gradual changing in their morphology that would allow them to become a woodpecker. So like basically they would move into an area and you would have some woodpeckers out there that, or not woodpeckers, but these proto common ancestors, you would have them start to develop similar features of woodpeckers that would allow them to survive in the environment that they're in. And over millions of years, what you have is a slow transition from that proto woodpecker common ancestor to the woodpecker that we have now. And it's all due to the survivability of the species in the environment that they're in.
Woodpeckers have specialized tongues to catch their food, so wouldn't they have starved to death before their tongues evolved?
Well, that kind of assumes that they can't eat or can't catch animals or their prey without that particular morphology. That's not actually what we find in nature. I mean, what I'm talking about is a slow, gradual change. And so you would basically have them just being able to survive better in their environment. Now, whether that means, they end up, having a new food source, or like with the woodpeckers, they develop the ability to, drill holes into wood that would allow them to survive better in some kind of way. So you have this change over time, but just because they don't have that particular morphology at that time doesn't mean that they were unable to survive in the past.
Isn't the bone change in pandas just a difference in species and not a difference in kind?
Well, I mean, they are different species, but everything is a difference in species. It's kind of actually hard to nail down what is meant by kind, because if you mean a biblical definition of kind, which, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's the idea that two organisms can't mate to produce offspring. I believe that's somewhere in the Bible is that's what it's meant by kind.
Actually, most creationists define kind at the family level.
There's why like a lot of different creationists have different ideas about what kind means. I can speak to that. It is a difference in species, but there are a number of species that look very similar but are genetically very different, like with the giant and red pandas. I haven't looked this up, but I don't think that giant and red pandas can mate and produce offspring, which I know is not the definition of kind. But but this difference in species is the best way to really look at it taxonomically. I get that right here we're delineating kinds at families, but it really kind of seems to me like most kind definitions just means different like morphology, but that's not how we really see taxonomically the animal kingdom or any kingdom.
If the earth moves slightly closer to the sun, we would burn up. So wouldn't God have created animals in a way that would allow them to survive in their environments?
Right. Well, I actually covered that in my presentation because that's actually not true. The Earth varies in its distance from the sun on the order of about 1 million miles in either direction. So it's not so much that it can move like an inch closer to the sun and we wouldn't be able to live here. The Goldilocks zone on our scale is actually very huge. So God could have done that. I mean, that could be the explanation, but that's not, at least to me, granted, all of this is my view of things. To me, that's not a sufficient enough explanation because we've had those explanations in the past. We've had the explanations of, well, God did this way, when in reality, we've figured out that different things happen for natural reasons, like lightning. At one point in time in the past, we thought that lightning came from the god or the gods. And now we know that it's actually a buildup, in nature, like a buildup of electricity in nature that fires off. I just find that the natural explanations provide actual explanations instead of, just saying that God did it, because I don't really feel like that's a satisfying answer.
Why is God using similar biological structures in various types of life a problem?
Well, I would say that the problem with that is that we don't find any specially created animals in nature. All animals have a lineage that we can trace back to a single common ancestor in the distant past. So it's not so much that different animals exist. It's more the fact that we don't see any specially created animals. All animals that we find, or all life that we find on Earth, can actually be traced backwards in time through their lineage.
If Jesus didn't die, why would the gospel writers write about it?
I didn't mean to indicate that they didn't believe that it happened. I totally agree that they believed that it happened. And when you consider how the New Testament was written, like the timeline of the New Testament writing, what you want to look at is what are our earliest manuscripts? Who are our earliest writers about it? What do they say about it? And what are their sources for it? And when you look at it that way, what you find is Paul states that he didn't get his information from any person on earth. That's Galatians 1:11. He separates himself out from anybody's testimony that existed on earth. He specifies that he only got his information about Jesus from Jesus himself through visions, as well as reading the scriptures. And so that was our earliest reference, right? And then we don't get another written reference until 70 AD, and that's with the Gospel of Mark. Mark is very obviously using Paul's work in order to inform his theology. And so in 70 AD, that would have been kind of the fuzzy line of where anybody could have still been living that would have seen Jesus. And so seen Jesus die or resurrect. And what you find in the New Testament, starting with the Gospel of Mark, is that they don't actually cite any sources. They don't claim to be eyewitnesses, and they also don't cite their authors. And so you don't have any eyewitness testimony to this happening. So it would be a similar thing is to believe that UFOs crash landed in Roswell, New Mexico. I'm not saying that, believing in the resurrection of Jesus is some kind of conspiracy theory. I'm just saying that we don't have any eyewitness accounts or actual evidence to support the idea that a UFO crash landed in Roswell, New Mexico. But we also don't have that kind of evidence, like eyewitness testimony or any kind of direct sources for like the Gospels. And our earliest source in the Gospel or in the New Testament is Paul, and he only cites visions in the Old Testament. So we don't actually have any eyewitnesses to it. We just have people that had visions of Jesus telling them about it. Oh, another big point is that Paul doesn't actually mention the word disciple at all. He never indicates anybody as being a disciple of Jesus. So it's he kind of further compounds on the fact that Paul only got his information from visions in Scripture.
Why couldn't humans populate the earth with 2 people if the common ancestor would have done that too?
So that goes off of the minimum viable population. I don't know what the minimum or what the population of the original and like the common ancestor would be, but also the common ancestor is not a single individual or anything like that. The common ancestor would have been like some kind of single-celled species, right? So there most likely were a lot of that particular species in the very beginning, but so the problem lies in the genetics. When you have a population that is pretty small, what you end up having is a lot of genetic defects that occur because of inbreeding in the population. The minimum viable population, it does the math on how much genetic diversity is needed for a population to survive and be genetically diverse enough so that they don't have these harmful genetic diseases or genetic defects that would cause the population to fizzle out and go extinct. A similar situation with that would be like with the koalas in Australia right now. Technically, right now, they're considered functionally extinct. That's because they've lost their environment, but also, if they lose too much of their population, they're not going to be able to reproduce. This also happened to the, I believe it was the white rhinos. They, I believe, are actually extinct now, or they either are extinct or they're about to be extinct. But that's just because the population dwindled down so far, they weren't able to recoup that because they didn't have enough genetic diversity. So I guess the answer to your question is that genetic diversity allows a species to grow in size, like populations of or groups of these species allow them to grow in size.
But why was the common ancestor able to do it, but humans couldn't?
Well, we don't have eyewitnesses to the original ancestor, obviously. But what we do have is, evidence in the genetics. We have evidence in the fossil record, and we have various evidence. Bits of evidence from around the world, in the rock layers, in various ways. We have evidence that shows that we all came from this common ancestor. And again, it's not that the common ancestor was a single individual. The common ancestor was like a single species, if you will. And there could have been, there most likely were thousands upon thousands of these species that originally developed on the Earth. And they would have gradually changed over time. And depending on their environment, they would have changed in specific ways. So the fact that we can trace our lineage back in time through the fossil record indicates that, we started out from a common ancestor. It's similar to how the original... I forget the monk's name. I can never pronounce it, but there was a monk that first postulated the Big Bang Theory. Lemaitre. He first postulated the Big Bang Theory as everything going back in time, and this was also observed by Stephen Hawking as well because of the expansion of the universe. So it's kind of more of a logical conclusion that we all came from a common ancestor.
So did all common ancestors pop into existence at once to give themselves themselves the genetic diversity needed to survive?
Well, I don't think that they all just sort of popped into existence at once. What the naturalistic explanation would entail is that organisms or these single-celled organisms would have started to develop. At a certain point in time in history, they would have started to develop on the Earth. What I would probably lean to is a minimum viable population or whatnot that you would also see in other single-celled organisms, because they would have started out as single-celled organisms. So I'm not exactly sure if they even have a minimum viable population, due to the fact that, the single-celled organisms, they reproduce by I can't remember the process name right now, but they split. They cut themselves. This is actually seen in the what is it called? It's like a white-tailed lizard. There's a lizard in Australia that only has a female version, like a female gender in its species, and it survives by pretty much copying itself. And so it doesn't really. As far as I know, it doesn't really have the problem with like genetic defects, because it just basically makes a clone of itself when it reproduces. It doesn't need like an egg and a sperm in order to propagate the species. It just sort of clones itself.